A New Jersey state senator has introduced a bill that would take away immunity from Cousin Janet's TSA goons who now routinely grope and peer at naked bodies just because people choose to fly. So will we be able to prosecute the TSA for sexual assault? Is this a good thing? Tonight's freedom fighters are Dr. Sally Sattel, Harvard professor Jeffrey Mirren, and Wendy Wright, president of Concerned Women of America. Wendy, to you first. Is it a good idea that the government imposes on us this very difficult choice of allowing a pornographic image of yourself to be put on its computers where it can be circulated to anyone, or requiring you to undergo a public groping and grabbing of your private parts, the nature of which would never be permitted anywhere in America without consent if it weren't done by the government?
No. And I think the reason why the government's doing it is because it has intimidated CIA interrogators and has fallen down on its real job of preventing the terrorists getting to the point of getting to an airport. I think it's a way of trying to cover themselves, and it treats citizens as if we're the suspected terrorists, rather than putting their focus on those who have been picked up for terrorism or alleged acts of terrorism, vigorously interrogating them to try and prevent further acts.
Yeah, Dr. Sattel, Wendy used an interesting word, intimidating. What is the effect on people? You have a parent being told to a child, take the shirt off your child. You have a woman who's had reconstructive surgery saying, let me touch the area that's been reconstructed. What's the psychological effect of that being imposed by uniformed officers of the government in a public place?
In part, it depends on how well prepared people are for that kind of treatment. But we're talking about basic sensitivity, and there are certain lines one shouldn't cross. And so that is, in fact, one of the dangers of this sort of procedure.
Professor Mirren, you have a corporation, an airline, and its customers, the flying public. And then you have the government injecting itself at the most critical juncture between the seller of the goods, the airline, and the purchaser of the goods, the public. Is there no end to the area where the government will inject itself? And secondly, what is the economic effect of the government injecting itself between the seller and the customer?
Well, I think it is unlikely to end for the reasons that someone mentioned just a second ago. The government needs to protect itself. It has to, as a political entity, make sure it's taken every possible step just in case something happens. And it has to respond to every little thing that happens, like the underwear bomb or whatever. The question is, what's the alternative? The right alternative to think about is, what if the airline just did all its own security, or the airline in conjunction with the airports? Then, when people are going to an airline, the airline says, you want to fly on our airline? You have to let yourself be strip searched completely, x-rayed, whatever. Then it's a purely private decision. It's not the government making you be stripped. It's just an individual accepting it if they want to fly on a particular airline.
And then, Wendy, airlines could have different levels of security depending upon the risk that people wanted to take. What's wrong with letting private enterprise and its customers make private choices rather than Janet Napolitano, who I affectionately call Cousin Janet, dictate to us what we have to do in public?
And when there's a direct relationship between the airline and the customer, the airline's going to be much more sensitive to the threats to the customers, both the threat to their own sense of privacy, but also the threat of an alleged possible terrorist getting on board. So anytime you can get the government out of the way when it comes to security issues like this, I'm sorry, not security, but rather an issue where the airline can be quicker in responding to problems.
I think the government is trying to intimidate us. I don't blame one particular administration, because all administrations like to do this. They like to keep people pliant or fearful so that they'll obey. Am I right or wrong, Doctor?
I think there's always a tension. There has to be surveillance, and some people are going to take offense and see it as incredibly intrusive. But the more people are informed and the more capacity I think that the airlines have for giving people choices as to how they might be surveilled, we might make some progress here.
Wendy Wright, Professor Mirren, Dr. Sattel, stay with us during the break, please. The body of evidence of what limits you're allowed to do with your own body. After this. If you would potentially harm no one but yourself, Should there be any limits to what you can do with your own body? To our freedom fighters again, American Enterprise Institute scholar and psychiatrist Dr. Sally Satel, Harvard economist and Professor Jeffrey Mirren, and Wendy Wright from the Concerned Women for America. Wendy, to you first. Aren't there such things as victimless crimes where there is no harm? And if there is no harm to the behavior, should the government be out of the business of prosecuting people for engaging in that behavior?
Well, let's look at specific examples like you brought up earlier. Prostitution. Prostitution treats people as objects or property to be bought and sold. And there can be profound impact, not only to the people who are engaged in it, but to the wives of the men who engage in prostitution, the profound effects of sexually transmitted diseases or pregnancies. So any system that creates a demand for treating people as objects, it crosses the line at the Declaration of Independence. It says that we're all created equal, which therefore means we should all be treated equal, not as objects.
I guess you're forgetting the part of the Declaration that says we have a right to pursue happiness, but we'll get to that in a minute. If you define crime as harm, which is the standard law school textbook 600-year-old definition of crime, and no one is harmed by the behavior because it is consensual, why should the government be in the business of prosecuting things that are essentially harmless?
I agree. It shouldn't be prosecuting those things unless there's a harm to other people who are not involved in the consent. So laws against driving under the influence, hey, those are completely sensible. They're trying to protect innocent people on the sidewalk, other drivers on the road, but preventing people from gambling, from prostitution, from using drugs, alcohol, and all that, I don't think there's any legitimate justification.
How about engaging in a business without a license, where the government wants you to sort of join its cartel so that it can regulate your business? A plumber who's just as good without a license as a plumber with a license. The guy with the license charges more. Why shouldn't you have that choice?
I think you should have the choice. The government, of course, claims, or advocates of those things claim that, say, by licensing physicians, they improve the quality of physicians and protect sort of unknowing consumers from faulty doctors. I don't think the evidence suggests that it actually has that effect. It mainly raises the price of medical services and harms everyone.
Isn't it better that people have free choice rather than the government telling them how to exercise that choice, Dr. Psychiatrist Patel?
In general, yes. But you mentioned gambling. Now, I like the idea of people having the options to limit themselves. So if you're a gambler, if you're someone who likes to gamble, you could enter into with a casino. If I go above a certain limit, then don't sell me any more chips. These kinds of things, they're kind of self-binding exercises.
Do you want the government, Wendy, to prosecute everything that you think is immoral or that there is a consensus in society is immoral? Or do you grant it that there are people outside the mainstream who want different lifestyles that are essentially harmless to third parties and the government should just leave them alone?
G.K. Chesterton had a great line: before you tear down a fence, find out why it was built. So I think it's important to look at why do we have these different rules or regulations.
I'll tell you why, because we had do-gooder, busy people in the government in the Wilson progressive era, and they decided they wanted to tell us how to live, and we still have those laws. Agree or disagree? Agree or disagree?
Are you referring to me? Well, let me give you another example that came up regarding the selling of organs. I actually donated an organ several years ago to a young man from Ethiopia.
Right.
And I did it because I wanted to help him. But 2 weeks before the surgery, there was an editorial in the Wall Street Journal that advocated the selling of organs. It actually caused me to think twice about doing it, even though I was eager to, because I thought people will assume that the reason I donated an organ was to benefit, to get money from
Understood.
it.
It was an altruistic act that you did, and our hats are all off to you. But people should be able to engage in the free market in order to buy what they want.
I'd like to point out that I'd like to point out that it will decrease altruistic acts, and no matter what you do, the poor will end up being down on the list. They will never be able to afford as much as Sally
Wendy Wright,
Satel.
Jeff Mirren, Sally Satel, thank you for joining us. Up next with the plain truth about modern-day prohibition.